So, first, I want to say that Loop was a very interesting short by Pixar about the autistic experience, and it was problematic. In lieu of simply discussing how I find this depiction a tad bit dangerous, I'll mention first what I felt was promising and accurate about its portrayal of an autistic girl. Loop was about an autistic girl who liked to canoe. She was given a non-autistic boy as a partner to go canoeing, and he learns how to see the world through her eyes, as well as how to communicate with a person who's nonverbal and autistic. The main character, Renee, was portrayed in some meaningful ways. She displayed stimming behaviors, she had repetitive behaviors, she had aversion to sound, she was nonverbal, so she had expressive communication differences, for which she used assistive technology, and she loved canoeing. When it comes to the portrayal of Renee, they did a very fine job, and generally speaking, I don't find all autistic representation in television or film to be particularly authentic. They did a good job here in Loop. However, I would be remiss if I didn't mention how problematic I felt Loop to be when it came to the care given to Renee. Now, let me preface this by saying I'm not on the spectrum. I know people close to me who are, but what I am is a caregiver and educator of people with disabilities. That is the lens through which I'm critiquing this short film. I also have a master's degree in special education. Not that this is necessary from a caretaker's perspective, non-clinical caretaker, if I'm being very specific, to see the problematic nature of this film. Now, unfortunately, when it comes to the representation of people with disabilities and the problematic nature of those representations, often the conversation devolves into a game of can you spot the abuse? That is not the intention here, although it may seem that way. My intention, rather, is to point out some of the things that I find problematic as a caregiver for persons with disabilities, an educator of persons with disabilities, and to illustrate some of the thoughts or perspectives that one might have as a caregiver for this people group. Now, it didn't take very much time, roughly 30 seconds, for me to start feeling a strong sense of alarm. The story starts with Renee in a boat with a life vest on. She seems to be waiting to go out canoeing. She's listening to this ringtone that she likes of barking repetitively, an autistic behavior. She seems happy. Her camp counselor calls out and says to Renee that he's putting her with someone new. A new student approaches the dock. He's late, but says he can catch up to the other campers that are canoeing in pairs. His counselor says no, he's putting him with Renee. The kid, Marcus, says the girl that doesn't talk? And don't you usually go with her? The counselor gives no explanation and sends them off. They paddle for a while and get pretty far into the lake. On the shore, the counselor watches them shove off from the dock. Marcus turns around for a while in the water. Renee rocks the boat a little bit. Renee gets Marcus to go by the porta potties where there's some grass coming out of the water that she likes to touch. Marcus takes her to a drainage pipe where sound is amplified for Renee to hear how cool her barking ringtone might be in there. Woof, woof, woof. The sound in the pipe overwhelms her, sensory overload. She pushes the boat out of the pipe after grabbing an oar, almost rolls into the path of a small speedboat, crashes onto the shore. She throws her phone at Marcus and into the water. She hides under the canoe and stims. Marcus tries to console her. Much time passes before she calms down. They leave the shore together. Watching all of that transpire provided me with a lot of anxiety. My problem here is twofold. Why did the counselor not go with them? And how many times did Renee need to almost die? In this narrative, they took an autistic kid, the creator saying she's 13 years old, on a body of water without being accompanied by an adult. Not only was she autistic, she was nonverbal and required assistive technology to communicate. And not only did she have to use assistive technology, she was accompanied by a boy who didn't know her or how to use that assistive technology. So let's start at the beginning. Why exactly did the counselor not go with Renee? He kind of arbitrarily decided, hey, Marcus, you need to go with Renee, and provided neither Marcus nor Renee the reason why they had to go together. Marcus was surprised. He didn't even know Renee's name. He knew her as the girl that can't speak. Marcus rightfully challenged the counselor, saying, "Don't you usually go with her?" Still, no explanation is given. That choice alone was the impetus for this video, because this is abuse. For Renee's primary instructor and caregiver to pass the buck of responsibility to an adolescent that is essentially a stranger to Renee is far more dangerous in just about every way than if he were to have gone with her. Marcus, well-meaning kid, didn't know Renee's name before the scene started. She, as a kid with autism, could have become frustrated with this foreign person guiding her on the water. She was in a situation where she was unable to communicate with her partner unnecessarily. Marcus had never seen her use her cell phone as assistive technology, but that was her means of communication. If something was wrong with her, she would have no way to be able to communicate that because he doesn't know how to read it. The program clearly uses pictures instead of words, even though most AT would have a picture with a word. When you're working with or caring for people with disabilities, they often have assistive technology or AT. It's important for everyone caring for them to understand how to use it because that's how you communicate with them and that's how they communicate with you. It isn't a toy, which is kind of how they framed it in the short. Like Renee was just super clever for figuring out how to pull up a picture of a poop emoji in order to signify the bathroom or toilet. No, persons like Renee who are nonverbal are taught how to use AT, and that can take a lot of time. You're essentially taking away that kid's ability to communicate her needs effectively when 1, Marcus doesn't know her and can't read her nonverbals well, and 2, Marcus doesn't know how to use her AT to communicate. Had he known how to use it like her, she might have been able to answer those questions that he was constantly asking her throughout their trip. But Renee wouldn't give her cell phone to Marcus as assistive technology if she'd never seen him use it. Now, there is nothing wrong with the buddy system. It is important that people who are non-autistic or people without disabilities to work with people with disabilities to help understand them better. I've seen lots of same-aged peers help out kids with autism, and it works, and it's beautiful. However, that occurs when there is training. The peers have to learn about their new friend with communication differences. They have to learn their behaviors. They have to learn their assistive technologies. You don't just jump up and say, let's put them together for an afternoon. It'll be good for them. That is unnecessary, and it can cause undue stress to the child with disabilities. And look what happened to Renee in the context of the narrative. She had a meltdown. She crashed on the shore with Marcus, threw her primary communication device into the water, and for what? Not to mention, all of this occurred while they're on the water. Now, let me preface this by saying I'm only using the context of the film for this critique, Renee's actual behaviors. Are there some kids with autism that can function well on the water in a canoe independently? Absolutely, I'm sure. Based upon what the film presented for Renee, I'd say not so much. I went back and forth with myself a lot about how deep the water actually was, how dangerous it was for a child with moderate to severe autism to be on the water with a child she doesn't know. And I say moderate to severe autism because autism is a spectrum. Something like Asperger's that most people have heard of is considered high functioning. And if it helps you to think of it as a separate type of disability or level, okay, moderate to severe autism is more in alignment with the manifestations of Renee's behaviors because of the severity of the communication differences that she has, the fact that she's nonverbal and displays signs of echolalia, her stemming behaviors, among other things. Now, concerning the water, we don't know how deep it was. However, it was deep enough for them to both be in the canoe without scraping the bottom of the lake. 2 13-year-olds being about 260 pounds, and then it also has to be deep enough for them to need life vests. And then it also needs to be deep enough for a small speedboat to be able to move on it. So, it was probably between 1 and 4 feet deep at its deepest, as a very modest estimate. That is plenty deep enough for a person to drown. That is plenty deep enough for a child to drown, and plenty of children who are non-autistic and 100% able-bodied, quote unquote, have drowned in water as deep as that. In fact, 25% of water-related deaths occur in 3 feet or less of water. So for Renee to be out in the middle of a lake, essentially alone because her primary care person isn't with her, is abuse. Neglect is abuse. It is passive abuse. There were at least 3 times where I thought, oh, she could drown here. Rocking the boat because she's frustrated and doesn't know her partner, capsize, easy. Sensory overload inside of the drainage pipe, canoe could have flipped over and she could have gotten stuck in under the canoe because there's no room inside of a drainage pipe, easy, drowned. They get out. There's somehow a threat of getting hit by a speedboat, or the waves cause her to fall into the water. Simple. Then they spend enough time shipwrecked out of sight of an adult for the shadows to change on the ground. She could have had a crisis situation. She could have had a seizure. People with autism spectrum disorder are many times more likely to be also diagnosed with some sort of seizure disorder. And her partner doesn't know her. So yes, Loop was problematic. If I were working with her counselor, I would have had some choice words for him that day for abdicating his responsibility to Renee for no apparent reason. If I were Renee's parent, they would be even more choicer words. Why did this apparently white counselor stick the brown child who has autism with another brown child when it was supposed to be his job to partner with her on the water? If I were Marcus's parent, I would ask, why would you even give him that responsibility all of a sudden without my consent? To be honest, when it comes to the abuse of people with disabilities, yes, race does come into play. Seems unnecessary to bring it up, and I know it sucks to do so, but when it comes to something that might be abuse of a person with a disability, you have to consider everything that might be impacting the care that person is getting. Now, as a writer, I understand that when it comes to creating interesting stories, you might have to do things or put your characters in situations that might be dangerous or irresponsible, like having the kids wander around the woods at midnight, or cut across a stranger's yard, or break into a house, follow a stranger home. However, when you're depicting vulnerable communities, you have to be aware that those same narratives change from unwise or risky to abusive. And the more danger that's around Renee, the more abusive the decision to make Marcus partner with her is. Had Renee been non-autistic, this wouldn't have been so bad. Had they removed the speedboat from the lake, less dangerous. Had they not had them go into a drainage pipe, much less abusive. Had they not been on the water or had been at a park or playground, everything they did in the short would have worked because there is no inherent danger. Or they could have shown an adult be responsible by following the pair on a separate canoe, since he should have been on the water anyway. A lot of kids programming likes to exclude adults from stories because I don't know kids' rule and parents are a drag or something, but people with disabilities, particularly moderate to severe ones like Renee's, are literally the most vulnerable population. You have to show that they're getting some type of appropriate care because the reality is people with moderate to severe disabilities are not a demographic that needs representation like peoples with brown skin tones. They need representation because they're vulnerable. And by and large, it is literally the people without disabilities who consume this media who will be the ones who make the policies that keep them safe. And the ones particularly for persons with moderate to severe disabilities who will have to provide them with lifelong care. I mean, in the making of Loop, they explained that the girl who voiced Renee wasn't able to record because of the foreignness of the studio environment, and the crew had to go to her residence to record her because she was less stressed out there. So why would you put your character through a stressful situation like seating her on the water with a foreign person who clearly would cause her undue stress? Maybe at that point in production, that lesson was already too late. So, from the perspective of an advocate and caregiver, yes, I find this scenario to be problematic. I generally don't speak on autistic representation because, one, some people like it when I might feel some portrayals are kind of generic or inaccurate. Some autistic representation is just ableist nonsense, and then generally speaking, there are a plethora of other disabilities that aren't represented in film, and a lot of people assume that just because someone isn't on the autism spectrum or have been diagnosed with Asperger's, there's, quote, nothing wrong with them, unquote, which is problematic for a whole host of other reasons. However, I have never been actively worried about a character with autism like I was watching Loop. I have done a lot of self-reflection on this, and I'd like to note again that the depiction of autism that was portrayed in the short was authentic in my estimate. However, it is problematic that the short doesn't acknowledge that the impetus of this scenario was based upon the abuse or neglect of a child with a disability from a caregiver who abdicated their responsibility to that child, while framing that abuse as teaching a child without disabilities tolerance or communication or something, while placing them both in the path of various dangers. I hope that in the future, we recognize that representation, which this is an accurate animated portrayal of autism, isn't as multifaceted as some would believe, and it's the bare minimum, especially if we don't consider care.